Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our celebration of Le Sacre du Printemps. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to say that if you don't know what's happening tonight, after the brief seminar on the piece, the orchestra will then assemble on stage and warm up, and our rehearsal starts at 7. And at the beginning of this rehearsal, we will be reading some excerpts, 4 different excerpts from the piece. Let me now introduce our speaker. His name is Michael Charry. He was the director of orchestras at the Maine College of Music for many years, and since retiring from that position, he continues to teach there. He was a student here at the school under Monteux in the 50s. He also was an assistant conductor to George Zell at the Cleveland Orchestra and wrote a most definitive, love-filled biography of George Zell. Please welcome Michael Charry.
Thank you, Michael, for that most gracious introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out on this soggy evening. This is not the wrong place. That was unarguably the most famous, most widely recognizable opening of any work of classical music, and perhaps of all music. It is, of course, that of Beethoven's Symphony No. 5, first heard in Vienna, Austria in 1808, 205 years ago. That is the only opening of any classical work that I can think of that is better known than this. The opening of the Rite of Spring, which you will hear tonight, along with 3 other excerpts from this landmark score. In its first public performance 100 years and almost 2 months ago, on May 29, 1913, it caused a famous riot in Paris, France, in the Champs-Élysées Theatre, which incidentally happens not to be located on the Champs-Élysées. Some said the cause of the riot was the shockingly modern music by the young Russian composer Igor Fyodorovich Stravinsky. Others attributed the riot to the unorthodox choreography by the brilliant young Russian dancer Vaslav Nijinsky, which depicted the scenario described in the subtitle of the ballet, Pictures of Pagan Russia, a scenario devised by the composer and his collaborator, Nikolai Roerich, who also designed the untraditional ballet-like costumes. Roerich was a painter and a mystic who was also an ethnographer and leading authority on the prehistory of the Slavic peoples, their myths, their rituals, religious beliefs and practices, which lent it great authenticity to the plot of the ballet. Incidentally, there is a Roerich Museum in New York City on Riverside Drive around 107th Street, containing many of his paintings and writings. The Rite of Spring is in 2 parts, the adoration of the earth and the sacrifice. The adoration takes place in the daytime, the sacrifice that night. The first part has scenes of ritual games, the game of abduction, the games of the rival towns, and leads up to the procession of the ancestors. The sage, the oldest and wisest man of the tribe, kisses and blesses the earth, and the ensemble stamps out the earth in a brilliant ending in part 1. Part 2 begins with a mysterious circle of young girls, in which one of them is chosen to be sacrificed and is celebrated with a dance. The ancestors are invoked, the elders of the tribe enter and witness as she dances herself to death. The Sacre was commissioned by the impresario, founder of the Russian ballet in Paris, Sergei Diaghilev, as the 3rd full ballet by the previously unknown composer Stravinsky, who had leaped to fame with his first ballet, The Firebird, in 1910. His next ballet score, Petrushka, in 1911, also became an instant success. Stravinsky would compose an opera and more ballets to come for Diaghilev after World War I in the 1920s. The uproar in the theater at the Rite's premiere caused Nijinsky to have to shout from the wings the counts of his ballet to the dancers on stage to try and keep them together, since they couldn't hear the music being played in the pit. Despite that, the dancers and the orchestra soldiered on to the end a half hour later. The intrepid hero of that premiere performance was the 38-year-old French conductor, Pierre Monteux. Stravinsky remembered the image of Monteux's back, quote, more vivid in my mind than the picture on the stage. He stood there apparently impervious and as nerveless as a crocodile. It's still almost incredible to me, Stravinsky wrote, that he actually brought the orchestra through to the end. Before Le Sacre, Monteux had previously conducted the premieres of Petrushka in 1911 and Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe in 1912. And exactly a year before the Sacre premiere, had conducted the premiere of the danced version of Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of Faun, choreographed by the brilliant Václav Nijinsky, who danced the title role with its shocking ending. Nijinsky later wrote that he found that Monteux had developed into an ideal conductor for ballet. He, quote, he was musically very well qualified, but during the last year he had improved immensely his choreographic sense. Without changing the tempi, which would have been unmusical, he had the kind of sense to know how to conduct for dancing. When I was a student at this school in the 1950s, I attended a soirée at the Monteux summer house down the hill from this concert hall. I recall that a fellow student asked Monteux about how to conduct for ballet. "Watch the feet," he answered. And a few very exact words. Pierre Monteux, 1875 to 1964, who became in his long lifetime one of the greatest conductors of his or any generation, founded this school in Hancock, Maine in 1943. He was a violin graduate of the Paris Conservatoire. At age 16, he was violist of the Geloso String Quartet, which played a Brahms string quartet for Brahms himself in Vienna, to Brahms's great approval. After World War I, Monteux toured with the Russian Ballet, which performed in 54 cities in the United States and Canada. He conducted at the Metropolitan Opera in New York from 1917 to 1919, was conductor of the Boston Symphony from 1919 to 1924, the Concertgebouw of Amsterdam from 24 to 34, the Orchestra Symphonique de Paris from 1929 to 38, the San Francisco Symphony from 1936 to 52, and the London Symphony Orchestra from 1961 to 64, and guest conductor of orchestras worldwide. Toscanini thought so well of Monteux that he invited him to conduct the first concert of the NBC Symphony, which was specially formed for Toscanini, but who was not available on November 13, 1937. Monteux first heard Stravinsky literally bang out the score of Rite of Spring on the piano to the amazement of the small group of listeners, which included Diaghilev and Nijinsky. They were, by all accounts, dumbfounded at the new sounds, new combinations of notes, and new combinations of rhythms that came from the pen of the young composer. Stravinsky remembered, quote, "When I finished composing the Rite of Spring, I played it for Diaghilev. He listened for a little while, and then he said, 'Will it last a very long time this way?'" To which Stravinsky replied, "Till the end, my dear." Monteux felt shock and incomprehension at first, but went on to know the score as well as the composer, writing his impressions in the early rehearsals to the composer who was not present, which helped Stravinsky rewrite and improve his orchestration in many places. Monteux performed another great service to the composer and the composition. Almost a year after the dance debut, he conducted the first concert performance of the Sacre without dance in Paris on 5 April 1914. After the concert, the throng carried Stravinsky on its shoulders out of the theater, quote, halting traffic on the Rue de Clichy and disturbing strollers on the Place de la Trinité, an eyewitness wrote. In a letter, Stravinsky expressed his thanks to Monteux for, quote, the most beautiful performance that I have heard of the Sacre du Printemps. He remembered it for the rest of his life as, quote, a triumph such as composers rarely enjoy. Monteux, for his part, gratefully answered Stravinsky, I do not forget what you did for my career at having me conduct your Petrushka and your Sacre. It was with these that I rose from the ranks, and I owe this to you. What made this music so new and confounding to its first listeners and made it the most influential composition of the 20th century? Some of its themes, after all, were derived from old Russian folk songs, as in Firebird and Petrushka. Some variations of the themes were very subtle, some quite obscure. The combinations of notes using familiar chords juxtaposed in unfamiliar ways and the complex shifting rhythms were new in 1913, and indeed, after many hearings live and on recordings, excite our senses to this day and will continue to do so for generations to come. Thinking back on his composing Le Sacre mused that, quote, it is it is as 20 and not 2 years have passed since the Firebird was composed. Here are a few examples. Take the opening notes played by one solo bassoon in the highest register of the instrument. It sounds strange and strained, as Stravinsky meant it to resemble a primitive shepherd's pipe, a dudki. Years later, when bassoonists had learned to master the passage, Stravinsky said that if he had known how well it would have come to be played, he would have written it higher still. For the accompaniment of the bassoon theme, later joined by the English horn, Stravinsky used a French horn followed by 3 clarinets and 2 bass clarinets. They played in parallel fourths. Not entirely innovative. Its inversion parallel fifths had been a part of vocal music in Gregorian chant since the Middle Ages. But one of the pitches they began on conflicted with the opening note of the bassoon theme as much as any other combination of tones could. The bassoon note was C, an octave above middle C at the piano. The horn note and the top note of the accompaniment of the C was C sharp, a half tone away from it as inversion. In the harmonic scheme of things, of the most distant dissonance from C. C sharp is an interval of a minor second, or at the octave of minor ninth, clashing this way, minor seventh. The fourths wander by half steps up and down the chromatic scale, while the bassoon and English horn play their prominent music. More and more themes are introduced and pile up in what Stravinsky characterized as a swarm of dudki, the pipes, the primitive shepherd's pipes. It reaches a climax and stops abruptly. Here are some of the themes that he introduced. It reaches a climax and stops abruptly, leaving the solo bassoon exposed, playing a fragment of the opening, but a half step lower in pitch, signaling the end of the introduction and leading to the next section. Curtain goes up on the first dance, not played in the coming reading. It's another example of Stravinsky's inspiration. Instead of it's just a half step lower, subtle, but it indicates something new this time. There's a combination of juxtaposition of familiar chords, each familiar and consonant in themselves, but is clashing as 2 chords B. A familiar E-flat 7th chord, and a chord that sounds like E major, but perversely written as enharmonic F-flat major, 1/2 step apart, played together produce a great dissonance. And together, repeated over and over in an ostinato in the strings with off accents in the strings emphasized by the 8 French horns, although not played tonight, but very well known. you will hear the section entitled Ritual of Abduction, or Game of Abduction. It's the same E-flat 7th chord, contrasted by a C major chord, with the dissonance C, D-flat, and E natural E-flat. On top of that, a melody in the high winds and brass is centered around D, a direct clash with both C and E-flat. An example of the innovation of the rhythm occurs in the section titled Glorification of the Chosen One. The Chosen One being the young maiden who found herself in the middle of the ritual mystic circle of young girls when the magic chords are sounded. It alternates regular and irregular meters, creating continually shifting and unexpected accents, 5/8, 7/8, 9/8, 6/8, etc., in relentless repetition, with dissonant chords and figures. It is preceded by one of the most unique measures of music, a measure of 11 strokes of the same polytonal chord, written as 11/4 time, sounding like this and connected to the previous music. In the rehearsal to come, you will also hear the famous sacrificial dance, the great finale of the Rite of Spring. In the ballet, the chosen young girl sacrifices herself to the gods of the earth to ensure the fertility of the harvest to come and the survival of the tribe. Having remained motionless since the moment she was chosen in the magic circle, she now dances herself to death, witnessed by the elders of the tribe. Because of the violent nature of the story, the music is the most dissonant and the rhythms most complex. If one interval of a minor second is dissonant enough, Stravinsky adds 2 minor seconds together in a cluster, moving in parallel. And the rhythm is a combination of 2s, 3s, and 4s. Curiously enough, the rhythms were so new that Stravinsky himself was not sure how to write them. This accounts for the several revisions he made in the various editions since the premiere. The original first measure was 5/16, later changed to 2/16 plus 3/16, so it's 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that pattern is repeated, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. Play it again. With dramatic rests on the beginning of each of those measures. The ending of the danse sacrale builds up with an insistent repetition of the bass drum and timpani with lower strings on every other beat. which the rest of the orchestra plays in cross rhythms against the bass. And with a rising scale and an outburst, the young maiden falls to her death, and the piece ends. That's really the bass. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. But against it, the rest of the orchestra is playing 2s and 3s and a kind of off-waltz rhythm. Stravinsky's genius was to combine known simple musical gestures in new ways, so that they sounded entirely new and remain fresh to this day. This great work, now 100 years old, was first conducted by the great man called by his family and Hancock friends Chummy, and we, his students, called maître, French for maestro. In Italian, it's maestro di musica, master or teacher of music. Indeed, we were so fortunate to have had as our beloved master and teacher, Pierre Monteux. And now I must end the talk to give the orchestra time to warm up and come to the stage. Enjoy the rehearsal. Thank you.